In this part of our lecture, we will consider calculations of main ratios, which are activity and liquidity ratios. We will use Apple company financial statements for 2020, which will be provided for you in additional materials to this lecture. I would like to start with the basic ratio, which represents us the net profit margin. And the basic formula for it, net profit margin will look like net income over the revenue. Now, as you open financial statements for Apple company for 2020, you might not necessarily find their revenue, but this will be instead represented by total sales. You will find their net income, and it is for Apple company for 2020 is just as follows: $57,441 million. And we will divide it over the total revenue for our company, which is for 2020 $274,515 million. Now, as you can see, net profit margin for Apple is 0.21. And this represents us first of all, we need to understand that this is an indicator. This is not an answer to our question, right? This is something which should be interpreted. And this is true for all the ratios. We have found the profit relative to the revenue, right? So we have calculated net profit margin by dividing the net income or net profit over the total revenue. Let's now look at some types of the ratios, which are activity ratios. And we will start here with inventory turnover. Inventory turnover. The inventory turnover can be calculated as cost of sales over the average inventory. Now, the cost of sales will be represented in the income statement or statement of a comprehensive income and can be found in additional materials to this lecture. Now, the cost of sales for Apple company for 2020 is $169,559 over the average inventory. Now, when we say average, we mean that it is something which requires further calculations. In each statement, in each income statement, you will particularly have information for 2 years. In our case, this will be 2020 and 2019. Inventory for 2020 for Apple company is 461, whereas the inventory for 2019 you can find equal to 4,160. Now we need to find average inventory which will be just adding both figures and dividing into the number of figures. And in our case, we will get here 8,221. As soon as we have two figures for 2 years here, we should divide it over 2, and that's how we will receive 4,110.5. And this directly goes to our calculations for the inventory turnover, to the denominator, 4,110.5. Now, what you should get here will be 41.3. What does this mean? This ratio shows us that how the company utilizes its assets. And basically, it means that it takes approximately 41 days for Apple company to sell its goods, to sell the inventory. When we have found the inventory turnover, we can now move to the days of inventory on hand, or DOH. Days of inventory on hand will show us for how long company holds its inventory, its goods on hand. And this can be simply found by dividing the number of days in the year, 365, over our inventory turnover, 41.3. And this gives us 8.84 as DOH, which means that the Apple company holds its inventory for approximately 8 or even 9 days, if rounded. We will now look at the receivables turnover. The next ratio will represent us the receivables turnover, which is found by dividing the revenue over the average receivables. Once again, we will be looking here at our average figures. Now, what we have for Apple company for 2020 is that we have revenue of 274,515 as revenue. And as for the average receivables, let's look at receivables in 2020, which was reported as 16,120, and receivables of 2019, which was reported as 22,926. Now we are looking for average figure here, and average receivables can be calculated as the sum of these two figures divided over 2. And it should be 19,523. And this is where figure goes, 19,523, giving us the result of 14.1 if rounded. This is actually the average amount of days when company receives money for the sales. We can therefore find another ratio here, which is days of sales outstanding. And days of sales outstanding will be calculated just as we have calculated DOH, but with using our receivable turnover figure. It is 365 days over 14.1. And here we get 25.96 days on average. In activity ratios, we need to consider also another portion of important ratios, which are represented by payables turnover, and payables turnover will be calculated just as receivables, but in reference to the payables. Payables turnover can be calculated as purchases over the average trade payables. For our company, for Apple company, in 2020, our purchases can be found as 169,559, and this should be divided over the average trade payables. Now, to find the average trade payables, we need to look at trade payables for 2020 in our report. In our report, it is 42,296, and trade payables for 2019, which was 46,236. Now, as we add them together and divide over 2, we will get an average resulting with 44,266. And this is the figure which we will use in our formula. Right here, 44,266. And this will give us 3.83 days turnover of the payables, which means that Apple company will receive money for its goods in average in 3 days. Now, number of days payables, can be easily found by dividing the number of days in the year, in the period, over our found payables turnover, which is 3.83. And we get here 95.3 days for payables, which represents us number of days, average days, for which company pays its liabilities.